you work your way up, and during your time, was one of the most popular McDonald's lawsuits, right? It was a woman pulls into the drive-thru, buys a hot coffee, puts it between her legs, somehow spills it, burns her vagina, and then sues you guys and ended up walking away with millions. So what's the background on that?
Well, I knew the operator who owned the restaurant. It was in New Mexico. And kind of the backstory is that there's always a little more.
Yeah.
She was in her 40s, a hot chick for southern New Mexico, driving a little sports car, and had a younger boyfriend with her. And so she hiked up her miniskirt to put the hot coffee. And in those days, coffee was coming out at almost 200 degrees at our coffee machines. Yeah. And when she speed shifted, she squeezed her legs together as she synchronized the clutch, and she burned herself. And apparently she went home, was in some discomfort, but still had friends there, and she entertained socially for the next couple of days. Had a boyfriend come in, but then on the third day went to the hospital to express some discomfort. And ultimately that led to a lawsuit. The insurance company decided the best way to pursue it was to bring in a New York firm to represent her in this little town in New Mexico. And Yankee lawyers don't necessarily do well in rural New Mexico. And ultimately, the ruling was against her. But it was against McDonald's. But later, on review, I don't believe it held. But the interesting thing to me was in the next year, there were more than 600 copycat lawsuits.
Oh, man. Yeah, of course.
So the worst I ever had was someone sued me claiming they slipped on a pickle in the parking lot. And they were directly proportional to the economy. As the economy got worse, the lawsuits went up.
Oh, yeah, I could see that correlating for sure. While you're doing your McDonald's career, and maybe even before, you've had an interest in intelligence and espionage, and you've written a number of books on it, and you've become quite the subject matter expert. When did all that start? What was kind of the trigger that got you, so addicted to that world and purchasing artifacts in that world?
I had an interest, Clint, while I was in Vietnam. I did some very, very minor things over there that hopefully were a little helpful. But I needed to make a decision when I left. Did I go in government service or go into business? And I really made a decision to go into business. And it probably was the best for everyone, but I certainly had and still have great respect for those people that work for the government, often at times at much lower salaries than they could make on the outside. And in the 80s, I'm an engineer by training, and I have a fascination with how things work and somewhat of a talent for explaining complex situations to help folks that perhaps aren't technically minded how technology has been used, and especially in the clandestine world, because many books at the time told you what clandestine officers did, but very few people told you how they did it and what they did. And that was always my fascination. Yeah. So I bought every book in the English language that discussed espionage and had photos. And the first thing I did was catalog every photo in a book with a picture of spy gear. And then I empirically started to say, well, what are the similarities and the dissimilarities, and develop different categories of equipment. And then I had the theory that form is determined by function. So if your goal is to read a microdot, a reduction of a page of text on a small 1 millimeter size piece of celluloid or film, then pretty much a good engineer will come up with the same solution regardless of where they are. So if you learn to see one East German microdot reader, well, probably the KGB version is going to be very similar, and the CIA version is going to come up with almost the same answer. And begin to write books and begin to travel around the world looking for interesting gadgets for the collection. And have enjoyed it. And anyone that visits the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. today, they can see in a beautiful facility the collection, and supported by some wonderful pieces of yours as well.
Interesting thing, my experience, and I think listeners would find interesting about the CIA is, there's different nicknames that especially us special operators have given them. One is the clowns in action, right? Because there was a time when you were like, man, these guys are supposed to be like high speed, and you never really got that sense. They've come a long ways, though, I will tell you that. And then the other one that I find even more interesting is Christians in action. And that one proved to be true in many cases where I was on a deployment and I was working with two case officers, and they both happened to be Mormon. And so we got into this discussion of the whole, like, okay, what's this nickname Christians in action that, I'd heard over the years, and it was mostly tongue in cheek, but they were like, no, think about it, man. These are Mormons telling me, like, I grew up traveling the world flipping people, from whatever religion they were doing, if they did, or they didn't have a religion, and I'm flipping them to believe in God. And I'm like, that's genius, right? Because they've already got all this experience building rapport and then trying to get people to convert. So what's your experience with that?
Well, and one other thing, they had great language skills. And
yes, missions, all the missionary, yeah.
So, and plus a couple other things. They more than likely didn't use drugs, and they probably could pass a polygraph. So when you factor all those things in, BYU is a hot spot for recruiting. And you could likely imagine that there's a political science professor there that probably is a talent spotter. And when he sees people he thinks could contribute, someone makes a phone call and they're later invited to come in for an interview. So I think that both the FBI did the same thing. Language skills are so important.
Right.
And the ability, a case officer, a CIA case officer could probably literally sell ice to Eskimos. And if you think about it, if you can convince a person to kind of either betray their own country or find reasons why joining allegiances with us is more important, then you could probably sell about anything to anybody. Yeah. And but to do it and still keep someone's respect, but keep them motivated, supported, and try to continue to succeed in the mission, it requires a lot of skill and planning and the ability to deal with adversity along the way. I think we see that. Yeah,
no, and I saw it with these guys. They were probably, the better of the case officers I'd ever worked with, mainly because of that background, growing up overseas, doing missions overseas, understanding culture. Like they knew all the details because they grew up in it, and then of course language. And if you got language and you understand the culture, then you're already at the 50% mark on gaining respect and building, trust. The next 50% is all the gift of gab and how you articulate yourself and convince them that working for the United States is the right thing to do. So, pretty interesting. You're listening to Can You Survive This Podcast? Thanks for tuning in. Please make sure to subscribe, rate, and share on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your favorite shows.